Wow, that intro is awesome. Hey everybody, this is Vandweller, and this is episode 2 of Hey Van. This is a series that comes out sporadically and occasionally in which I answer sit-and-go questions emailed to me by you, the membership of deucescrack.com. And if you have a sit-and-go question you want answered in a future episode of Hey Van, send me an email at vandweller@deucescrack.com. You can also send me a private message on deucescrack.com, and my username there is vandweller. And be sure to include the phrase "Hey Van" in the subject line so it gets sent to the right email folder and I see it. Really enjoyed doing the last episode. I did not receive a ton of questions, which, I received enough, but I didn't receive a whole hell of a lot. So apparently you guys know everything there is to know. So I don't know how many more of these I'll do, but if I get enough questions to do another one, I'll do another one. But anyway, let's dive in. I have 3 or 4 questions to do for this. The first one is, hey Van, can you tell me how ICM works for non-Hold'em sit-and-go, specifically PLO? Thanks in advance. Sure. Now, I have to preface this by saying that I am not an expert on pot limit Omaha. I mean, I can play, there's a game that goes in Oklahoma, which is the nearest casino to me, and I have no doubt that I can beat that game there because everybody's moronic, and I just have good poker sense. But I will say, but for this question, I don't need to be an Omaha expert. And that's because, why? Well, because ICM is a relationship between chip stacks, not cards, right? If we remember from my previous video, the ICM from scratch, we went through in detail the ICM procedure, right? What is it? What is the ICM procedure, right? What does it do? Well, it takes each player and it takes his chip stack and it relates it to the other player's chip stack, and it uses that relationship to find out how often each player, given his chip stack, given his total amount of, given his percentage of the chips in relation to the total amount of chips and so forth, how that is going to make him finish in each given spot, right? So a certain chip stack will, out of the total in relation to the other player's stack, will lead him to finish first a certain percentage of the time, will lead him to finish second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on, percentage of the time, right? And then what you do is you relate a player's chance of finishing in each place to the prize for each place, right? You would multiply. You multiply a guy's chance of finishing in first by the prize for first, his chance of finishing second by the prize for second, and so forth, and you total all that up, and you integrate that all into one number, and that's the number that we call a player's tournament equity. And that's all that ICM is, right? It goes on the presumption that your chance of finishing first in the tournament is your proportion of the total chips, and that's how you get first. And then it assumes that other players finish first, and then how often on that same presumption you get second, based on your amount of the remaining chips except for the guys that finished second, and so forth. We went through all that, right? Now, as I have also noted in the past, ICM is, people say, well, that's the math of push and fold, right? ICM is push-fold math. But as I have pointed out, it's really just equity math, right? All that ICM is a way of mapping a chip setup to equity, right? Now, that means that equity math has really nothing to do with what game you're playing, right? And of course, push-fold math is broader than ICM, right? ICM is just for sit-and-goes and tournaments, but there can be push-fold math in a non-tournament context in just a regular cash game, and the same, equation holds, right? And that push-fold math, assumes ICM, which, at least for tournaments, the push-fold math includes ICM only so much as ICM gives you like a risk-reward context, right? ICM can tell you what your equity would be if you were to fold, if you were to shove all in and the other guy were to fold, if you were to shove all in and he were to call, and you would either win or lose. And that's what ICM does, is it tells you basically the risk-reward part of that equation. But of course, that's only one part of the equation, right? I gave you that equation in earlier videos, the Flying Blinds video, and in the ICM from scratch video, and there it is again, right? And the push-fold math essentially comes down to you're going to push all in, and your opponent's either going to fold or call, right? When he folds, you're going to win the amount in the pre-flop pot, meaning the blinds and the antes. And of course in a tournament, that means the equity increase represented by winning that pot. And when he calls, either, well, you're going to be gambling, right? Either you're going to win that gamble or lose it. And when you win it, you're going to win the equity boost provided by winning the amount of the effective stack and the dead money, you know, the blinds and the antes. Or when you lose, you're going to lose the amount of equity represented by your stack. Now, if you notice in here, nowhere in there does it say the EV of a shove is, you know, all this if it's no limit Texas Hold'em, right? It doesn't say that anywhere in there. All it says is a fold percentage, a call percentage, and then some percentages of wins and losses, right? It doesn't say Hold'em win and loss, Hold'em lose percentage. It doesn't say 2 cards versus another 2 cards. All it says is win and lose, right? So this kind of brings up sort of a philosophical point that was kind of really my aha moment when I realized this in poker some years ago. Poker is not a game of cards, right? And this actually comes right out of the Harrington book, right? This is like I remember when I first realized this point, because it was right there in the Harrington book, and it was within the first 15 or 20 pages. In fact, I'm going to go get that. I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to go get that section. But I mean, just to paraphrase what the section says, it says that poker is not a game of cards. It is a game of wagering that uses cards to construct a context for wagering, right? Let me go get that. I'm actually going to go and scan. This is ridiculous. I'm going to go and scan my book, and I'm going to bring out that page. So hold on one second. So there it is. This is actually the point. This is page 10 of the first Harrington book. And of course, the whole Harrington series was, a really important thing for tournaments, right? And poker in general. I mean, it popularized the continuation bet. It introduced like the zone theory, how you inflection points, and how your strategy should change as your chip stack changes in the tournament, and so forth. But to me, all that was really great. But to me, the thing that really was an aha moment for me, right, was this page 10, right before it even gets into the meat of the book, right? It was this identification, which to me is one of the most pregnant identifications in all of poker, and really meant a lot to me personally, even more than reading Theory of Poker and all those other stuff that came before this. In fact, I remember where I was when I read this paragraph. It was early December 2004, and I worked at a used bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, it's a great store called Frugal Muse, and anybody that's in Wisconsin should go there. And I was in the back room on my lunch break, and I had ordered the book. We had ordered the book, I could get like a 45% discount on books because I worked there. So I was reading this book in the back, and I went to the first 10 pages or 9 or 10 pages or so, and it wasn't, there was like glossary of terms and so forth, and I finally got to something interesting, and here it was. And he said, like, and I was playing poker before this for several years, right? And I was not a fish by any means, but I didn't know that I had really any deep understanding. I just kind of knew what to do sort of mechanically. And then I read this, and he says, like all variations of poker, No Limit Hold'em looks like a card game, but it's not really, right? No Limit Hold'em is actually a game of wagering based on imperfect information that uses cards to construct the situations for wagering, right? And that's it. Now, it's easy to read that and just say, all right, he's saying that No Limit Hold'em isn't just about cards, it's about situations, and it's about estimating your opponent's hand, and it's about uh, things like that. It's easy to gloss over that and kind of not understand what's actually being said, right? What's actually being said here is that No Limit Hold'em actually is not a card game, right? What are the functions of the cards in Hold'em, and by extension, as he says, all variations of poker, right? All it is, in essence, is an excuse to wager on things, right? It's a thing that sets up every single time a new hand is dealt a risk-reward context, a win-loss context, how often some other person is going to lose versus how some other person is going to win, right? So cards are just an excuse for betting. They're not. I used to before this. I used to think, okay, cards, poker is a thing about. All right, what do I do if I have Ace King, and is Ace Queen a good hand, and so forth. But then I really realized that none of that stuff makes any difference. Whether it's Ace King and Ace Queen, and is Pocket Eight's really a Category 2 hand. None of that stuff made any difference because all it came down to was numbers. What it came down to, the cards were there just to set up winners and losers, right? Now, does it really matter how those winners and losers are set up? What determines those percentages? No. So if you think by an extension, right, like horse racing or sports betting, right? By extension, horse racing and sports betting aren't about horses or teams, right? They are games of wagering that use horses in sports matches to create a betting context, right? And that's the same for any betting game. So it just so happens that we all are playing, a game that has 2 cards and so forth. But it could easily be 4 cards. It could be 17 cards. It doesn't matter as long as there's some way to determine how often your bet is going to win or lose, and therefore you can adjust your betting and wagering and so forth. So anyway, that's kind of more of a philosophical and a biographical point. And again, this is a thing that, the Harrington books were really important, but for things that happened much later in this book and in the second book, and not really for framing what poker actually is in this really deep kind of fundamental way. And it's when I read this, I stopped reading after this, and I was kind of blown away, I remember, and I got into this about, 15 minutes into my break, and I just sat there thinking about all the implications and how everything I knew about poker was going to be recast in that light. And that was really the birth of my being, an analytical kind of poker player, as opposed to someone who just, followed the hand rankings and, went by, convention and things that I had done before or read in books. And this really led to me being a poker thinker, was that paragraph, which again is easy to overlook. But when you really slow down and take a look at what it's actually saying, it's really quite profound. So anyway, back to sit and goes, right? This EV of a shove equation, right? Does it have to be 2 cards that determine, the win and loss percentage? No, it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 17. It doesn't even have to be cards. You could play a sit and go with dice, right? Everybody gets dice, and like 4 or 5 dice, and they shake the dice, and they hold them under their cup, and they peek under their cup when it's their turn. And given how many, how high their dice roll is, they could put in a wager. And then all the other players would have to look at their secret dice roll and then determine how they want to act and what they think that guy's range of points is, and so forth. And they bet and wager accordingly. So it doesn't have to be cards, right, that determine it. It could be dice. It could be a random number out of 100. Everybody gets a random number out of a hat under 100 and peeks under it when it's their turn, and then wagers based on it. And there could be bluffing, and so it really has nothing to do with cards. So how does this come back to the question of Omaha? Well, ICM has nothing to do with, it has as much to do with Omaha as it does with Hold'em or Stud 8 or whatever. All that ICM does is relate your chip stack to the other chip stack to determine what your equity is. And then when you get to the poker math, all that poker math is a way of relating risk and reward, which is, these, pot, stack, blah, 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 to how often you're going to win or lose the gamble, right? So Omaha ICM works exactly the same, right? Any poker game that if you play a sit and go, doesn't matter what the thing is, your equity, if all of a sudden you're, I mean, like, all right, you take like a mixed game, like a five game mixed game or a horse or something, right? Your equity in the tournament doesn't change because you're playing a new game. Now, it might change because you have a different skill level, but, on a very basic level, putting aside your skill level, your equity in the tournament doesn't change, right? So why would ICM be any different? Now, the thing that does change in ICM, and this is where you actually have to talk to an Omaha expert, maybe you can talk to Vanessa or something, who is an expert at tournaments in Omaha, is, how the dynamic of, the fact that you can't shove all in PLO, you have to make a pot, like if folds to you in the small blind, you have to make a pot size bet only is what you're limited to, and then your opponent can either call that, and there might be post flop, or he might re-raise, and then you have to decide, is it worth it, or so forth. The mechanics of that is something that I can't answer. I'm not an expert in Tournament Omaha, unfortunately. I would like to be. So if Vanessa wants to give me some free coaching in that regard, I'd be happy to take it. But if you have specific questions about the mechanics of a particular game, then you have to ask an expert on that game and betting structure. But if it's strictly the question is, how is ICM different, then I know enough to say that, and it isn't. All right? Next question. Hey, Van. In a couple of videos here on DC, they have used the word spike call, and I think I might have a pretty good idea, but I'm not sure exactly what this means. So what does this means? Thanks. P.S. Loving the single content in the site, and it's not even a site that focuses on tournaments. I know, it's really amazing how good the sit-and-go content is here. And it's not even, I don't even just mean me. I mean, I think AMT and Bones, and I Wear Goggles, and Vanessa, and so forth, they all do fantastic job. So while it's a small amount of content, I think it's pretty high quality, even apart from what I have done, which I think is not bad. So the question is, what is a spike call, right? Well, it's always useful when you're trying to define a term to first distinguish it from things that it's very similar to, right? So that way you don't get confused, all right? So I guess the more question is, what isn't a spike call, right? Now, the context is someone shoves on you in a sit and go, or you shove on someone in a sit and go, and they make a call that you find to be surprising or questionable, right? Well, a spike call, it can't really be a bad call, right? Somebody makes a call against you, and they make a losing play. Just a simple bad call is usually just going to result from somebody misjudging some condition in the game, like someone calls you and he doesn't understand what your range is, right? Maybe he doesn't understand the risk-reward context, the equity ceiling, and he doesn't understand that, he can't call here because the risk-reward context is so skewed that there's no possible way he could be a winner here. Or he might not understand, basic hand matchups. He doesn't understand that queen 6 offsuit isn't a strong hand against your range, right? Even if he knew what your range were. So either he's not going to know something about your range, he's not going to know, or he's not going to know something about his hand's equity against whatever he perceives your range to be, or he's not going to understand just the pay structure and how it should change how he values his hand, right? So that's just a bad call, right? People can make bad calls and not be making, a spike call. Well, what about a loose call, right? Somebody might make a loose call on you, but that's good, right? There could be apparently loose calls. You say, how did he call with that, right? With like marginal hands, or even solidly plus EV against your range. If he calls against you, given the dead money in the pot and your range, there are times when it can make sense to call with a lot of hands that look goofy, depending on what his equity is, what your range is, how much dead money there is. A guy can make a lot of surprising calls that look loose but are actually correct, right? So we want to distinguish it from just being a bad call or from being a good loose call, right? That's not a spike call, right? A spike call is something different than that, right? A spike call is certainly an equity losing call. It is a bad call, but it's a specific type, right? A spike call is a bad call that someone makes knowingly. They know they're making a bad call. It's a call that hurts both players, himself and you, the guy who's shoving on him. And it's usually done for metagame purposes, right? So let me try to bring up in Wizard what might be some sort of plausible spike call here. All right, so I've set up a scenario. It's the bubble of a standard 50-30-20 nine-handed single table sit and go. And it's there's two players here that kind of have roughly half the stacks of the two main people here. The blinds are 200, 400. We can make it probably this, and it would still be a bad call. We as the we're going to be the small blind, right? That's us over here, and we're shoving with any two cards. Why are we shoving with any two cards? Because we know that our opponent can't call, but except with a very narrow range here, right? We know that he has to be so risk averse because of the presence of the other two short stacks that he needs to be a significant showdown favorite. He can't just be a mild favorite, 60, 65%, whatever. In fact, we can even work out how big of a, if we wanted to. He can't be, like a 60, 62%. Maybe he has to be a 65 or 70% favorite or something to show down. We also, the presumption also is that the guy in the big blind is a regular, smart-thinking player who knows more or less when to shove and call. Now, let's say throughout the entire tournament, we have been shoving on him because we're able to, and we've been taking a lot of pots on him, and eventually he decides we shove with our any two as we can because he's only really allowed to call with such a small range that it makes it, we're justified in shoving any two cards. We know that this guy's only justified in calling with eights plus, even if we're shoving any two. And of course, it doesn't let us make that range, but because for some reason sit and go wizard will, it's silly in that way. It'll allow itself to create a range that's eights plus with no unpaired cards, but it doesn't allow us to do that. So I don't really quite understand why that is, but that's what it does. So anyway, he can only call with a range like that, and of course even narrower than this because he can't call with these unpaired hands. And yet he decides to call us with something like that, right? Now, this is the presumption that this is a good regular player who knows, or at least understands his equity context. He knows he can't call with this hand, and yet he does anyway, right? So is there a reason to do this, right? Now, he might know that, while it's negative, it's not, one of those massively negative calls that's like minus 10% or, minus an entire buy-in negative equity. He might know that while it's negative, it's not super negative. And he also has to know that ace 10 is, from a chip perspective, right, which we can look at, way ahead of your range, right? I mean, from a chip perspective, he can call 65% of the time, and it's only because of the structure that he can only call 3.2% of the time. So this is a guy we presume to know this, and yet we find him making this call. Now, if this were a person we did not think were savvy, then we would have another opinion of it. But this is a guy who should know better, right? And that's what a spike call is. It is a bad call made knowingly by a guy that is intended to hurt you and kind of disregard, and of course by extension by hurting you, I mean it also hurts himself as well. And the only purpose this can have is for metagame purposes, right? Now what is the metagame purpose? The metagame, well of course metagame, what does that mean? for those of you who don't know that term. Meta game, meta just means outside or above, the thing that is actually in question, right? So meta game means outside of this particular game, right? So the purpose is, okay, maybe this guy realizes that this is, a negative call by certainly a substantial but not, murderous amount, right? He might know that. So knowing that, and if he has an opinion of you that you are a savvy player, paying attention, making good any two shoves and playing exploitively and so forth, and capable of adjusting, by making this call and assuming that you're going to see it, what he's trying to do is to buy folds in future games, right? So by making this negative expectation call with a negative expectation of 2.3% of a prize pool, he hopes to gain in future games enough folds because of this, because of the way that you've perceived this player, that you're going to change your game enough that you will now give him some folds, which will total up in the future to more than this 2.37% negative that he took, right? So that's really what a spike call is about. Now there's probably a type of spike call which is he's just on tilt and mad at you and just wants to hurt you and doesn't care about metagame. He just wants to hurt you, and that's certainly can be a part of it too. But if we're really talking about strategically the spike calling have a use, it has to be that, right? It's to gain in the metagame at the expense of this particular game, right? He's sacrificing equity now to gain equity from extra folds in future games against you and against possibly other players who are watching and seeing this, right? So is it valid, right? Is spike calling something that, can be a valid thing to do? Well, I would say it can be, but there are certain conditions, right? You have to be playing in games where you frequently play with the same players over and over again, right? And you have to presume that these people are paying attention and that it has the possibility of implanting like a seed of doubt in your opponent's mind as to your ability, right? Or to what you think is a good, is a good hand to call in that situation. So if you're going to spike call, you just can't make a call so bad, right, that nobody could possibly believe that you think it's good, right? If in this situation he called with 8-5 offsuit, there's nobody in the world that would say, boy, this guy really doesn't if he knows that we know that he's a reasonable player, not a lunatic, he can't spike call with 8-5 offsuit, because that's going to have because we're going to know he's spike calling us and we're not going to adjust, since we know that he's not typically going to make these calls, right? So it can't be a call so bad that he couldn't possibly think that you think it's a good call, right? Does that make sense? So to have any effectiveness at all, this kind of call has to be with a hand. If you're going to make the spike call, it has to look to your opponent like you might actually believe you're making a good call, right? So what does this mean? This means that this really presumes that your opponents are paying attention, that they have a read of you that you're good, and that you have a read of them that they're good, and your read of their read of you is that you're both good. I mean, you both have to believe that you are both good to a certain extent, right? And, for extra value for this, you really want the other opponents to see this. So I would say that you really don't have any business spike calling at low stakes sit and goes where no one's paying attention, or players don't have like second and third level reads of players, that they might not even have first level opinions of other players. They just go in and play their mechanical strategy. You've got to be in a game with thinking opponents, and there aren't enough of them. And if there are, you don't play with them regularly enough in low stakes sit and goes, like $10 and below, $20 and below. Now, as you start to get like into 30s, like the 38s and 60s or whatever the buy-ins are for your site, you will start to play with, a faction of players who are, thinking. But I think they're going to be, they'll probably be multi-tabling, and they might not even see the results of the showdown. All that they see is that they shoved, you called, and they doubled up, or you doubled up, or whatever happened. They just might see the results and not the play, right? In which case it has no value. And that's going to be the case at these kind of grinder levels, like $38 and $60 ones, where it's not that they're not paying attention, it's that they can't be paying attention because they're playing so many games. And there's enough fish in that even at those levels, that you're not necessarily going to be playing with the same players a ton of the time. Now, you might have a lot of hands against somebody, but maybe you playing 10 games a day per them, and you play 100 games a day. Who knows? Or if you're going to avoid regulars altogether through table selection, through game selection, there's no reason to be making spike calls against randoms, right? Because you don't know if you're ever going to see them again. So it has to be, a guy that you have a history with. So to my way of thinking, spike call really has its main value in tournaments, in sit and goes that are, triple digit buy-in and more. If you're watching like, nosebleed sit and goes with like, all the regulars up there, okay, they can spike call each other and, kind of level each other over and over again and do goofy things and all for the metagame. But, really there just is no metagame at low and medium buy-in sit and goes, not to the extent that it makes, making these kind of calls profitable, in my opinion. And as I said, it's got to be plausible. So anyway, a spike call. Just to summarize, I would say it's a bad call that is made knowingly, that hurts both players, and it's for metagame purposes, right? And it presumes that your opponents have an opinion of you, and that they have an opinion of your opinion of them, that they're paying attention, and that they're regular enough for it to actually have some effect on how they play you in the future, and that it's a plausible enough call that they might think that you don't quite know what you're doing, and so therefore they'll adjust their strategy. So I hope that answers your question. Let's go on to another one. Hey Van, do you really live in a van? Why on earth would you do such a thing? And I wouldn't answer this question because I do get the occasional, goofy question, but I got this 3 times within the span of a week. So I figure if 3 people really want to know, I won't take long to answer, but I will answer it. No, I do not live in a van, but I used to. In fact, I lived in 2 vans, not simultaneously. Well, actually for a week I did. Yeah, I really did, and it was for several months back in 2006, 2005 to 2006? I guess it would be 2006, when I was living in Madison, Wisconsin. And I did live in a van. In fact, here's a picture. The one on the right over here is the first van that I lived in, and I wasn't... It wasn't, I didn't buy it for the intention of living in it. I bought it because, I don't know, I just hauled stuff around, and I don't know, I bought it because it was interesting. But what ended up happening is the nearest poker room at that time was 4 hours away in a place that's like an hour's west of Minneapolis called it was a St. Croix Casino in Turtle Lake, Wisconsin, right? And so I had a job where I had enough flexibility with my scheduling that I could actually schedule myself for like 3, 4, and 5 days off at a time. And so I would go up there, and it occurred to me that, and I didn't make a lot of money at that time, but I liked playing poker, and I was winning at it. It occurred to me that I could just sleep in my in this GMC Safari up there in the parking lot of the Indian Casino. So that's what I did. Instead of paying like the $70 a night, it would be in the in the hotel of the casino, or right next door to it. So I figured I would I would sleep in that, and I couldn't really. It wasn't really in my budget to pay. I wouldn't have been able to go up there if I had to pay the hotel amount because I was just learning casino poker at that point, and I would actually go up there with about $400, like enough for 8 short buy-ins, and I would buy in short, and I made about 25 such trips, and I never came home a loser, right? So I mean the games are really good even for short stacking, So and I learned a lot by doing that. So it kind of got in my head that hey, it's not so bad to sleep in a vehicle, right? So I got to the point where I have to say this: I am a big believer in like capitalism, the free market, entrepreneurship, innovations, new technologies, new gadgets, new products, and convenience, right? I believe that that is a value. But I think in this culture, you can kind of, just in your own mind, you can let it get so far that you end up spending money and time on things that really aren't worth your time. If you live like in an apartment and you want to have people over, well then you've got this big empty spot in your apartment where there's no furniture. You don't need any furniture. But all of a sudden there's this big empty spot there that looks empty, and you don't want your apartment to look weird when people come over, so you have to buy a table to fill it, and of course you can't just have a table with nothing on it, so you buy a lamp, and then all of a sudden, oh, well, look at that wall. That wall is kind of blank. Maybe I got to buy a decoration. All of a sudden you're buying just a bunch of crap that you don't need. So, I mean, that's always kind of been my attitude, right? So at a certain point, I just got kind of sick of living in an apartment, and I just kind of wanted to pare down my life down to its essentials. And so I gave my notice in my apartment, and I moved into this van. And what I did is I built myself a bed platform where I could store all the stuff that I would actually need. Right? I built this from hand out of plywood, birch plywood, pretty strong, smells nice. Drawers here, and they go all the way in. Right? And so what I did is I put it in this van. And there it is right there, and there's my bed. And when it was time to go to sleep, I would cover all these over with fabric, right? All the windows over with fabric. And there's another shot of it in the van where there's not a lot of room. You can see. I mean, you push those drawers in, you're right up against it, so it's pretty confined. And after doing that for a while, I decided to trade up to this van here, and it was a lot bigger. I don't have a picture of the bed or anything inside the van, but that's where it was when I first bought it. And you can see, hopefully, the bed only came up to about right here, and there was a lot more room and stuff like that. So, whoops, let me go there. Here we go. So, anyway, and what else did you ask me? Oh, why would you do such a thing? Well, as I said, I get kind of sick of consumerism and stuff like that. Although, again, I do believe in capitalism, the free market, and all that other stuff. But for me, I just wanted, some simplicity, and it had some really good side effects. I kind of have a somewhat social anxiety streak in me where, if left to my own devices, I'll just stay home and not go out. But what this did is, I mean, it forced me to, you don't want to sit in this van all day, so it actually forced me to go out and interact with people. I would, play poker in the coffee shop on my laptop. I would go places. I couldn't just sit around and watch TV all day. So I'd go to the park. I would, just go to different places, walk around, talk to people. So, it actually instilled a lot of confidence in me. And, and since I had to shower, right, I couldn't shower in here. I didn't own my own shower, so I had to shower at the gym, which meant I went to the gym like every day. So I worked out every day, and I had very little, almost nothing in the way of bills. So I had all this disposable income, so I could be generous and give stuff to friends. I mean, it was really an incredible experience. And if somehow my girlfriend kicks me out of the house right now, I would happily move back into some sort of van. Unfortunately, I don't have this van anymore, but I would happily move back into a van for a while and, maybe travel around. And I have this fantasy that I will do a series here on Deuce's Crack called Vandweller's Traveling Sit and Go Roadshow, where I'll actually travel to like 6 or 7 or 8 different members' houses and do live sweat sessions with them in exchange for being able to sleep in their parking lot. So I don't know. That's kind of a fantasy of mine, but, that's only if my girlfriend kicks me out. So here's hoping. But anyway, it was overall a really good experience, and then it only ended because I had this harebrained scheme to move my friend to Las Vegas and short stack 6 max cash games, which I'm not going to talk about. But that was a whole other adventure in itself. So anyway, thanks for the question. I hope you don't mind me taking like 5 minutes out to talk about that. But hey, 3 people asked, so there it is. All right, next question. Hey Van, Full Tilt has knockout tournaments that pay a bounty for each player you eliminate. It seems to me that many players go too much out of their way to knock other players out. Do you agree? How much should possibly knocking someone out matter in your decision making? Should you try to take risks early to build a big stack so that you can knock more people out, presumably later, right? All right, well, I have to say that I do not myself play the knockout tournaments, but my girlfriend does. And I have observed her playing, and I do think my initial impression was that on the whole, at least early, when they first started, players do go a little bit too much out of their way to knock players out. How much should possibly knocking someone out matter in your decision making? Well, let's look at it this way, right? Here's the lobby of a knockout tournament, right? There's 403 players. The buy-in is $10 plus 1. And it says the prize pool is 3224, which doesn't make sense if you think about it, because there's 403 times 10, which it should be, $4,030. But you got to understand they take out $806 from the prize pool already. So that's not accounted for. They take out 806 from the prize pool to pay all the knockouts out, right? But really, strictly speaking, the prize pool is 40-30 at the beginning of the tournament. So you do have your stack, is worth its full $10 at the beginning, because you're presumed to have an equal share of also the knockout pool, right? So if we think about, how much more loosely should we play in order to knock people out? Well, let's take a look at. Imagine that we are in the first hand, right? When we need to do this sort of by comparison, right? Let's say it's a non-knockout tournament, right? And it's the first hand. And just to make the example easier, we're just going to say that the starting stacks are 10 big blinds. So if you want to imagine that it's a super turbo, fine. It doesn't really change anything as far as what we're doing. And also, I want to say that we're going to ignore any kind of ICM, payout effects for the purposes of this question, because it's not really relevant at all, and I hope you'll see that as we go. So when I recommend when I say certain ranges are ranges that should be played and so forth, I don't want you to take those ranges seriously. These are just to illustrate the point. These are not how you should play necessarily. This is just to illustrate the point of how we are compensated for the knockouts, right? So let's say it's the first hand of a non-knockout tournament. We're in the big blind sitting there, and our stack starts out as 10 big blinds. So we've got 9 big blinds behind with 1 in the middle. Folds around to the small blind who shoves, and we put him, for some reason, whatever, on the top 15% of hands, right? And so we'll just say, I don't know, something about him, we know that it's the top 15%. Well, all right, let's take a look at what we have to do. We have the choice, do we call or not? Do we put our remaining 9 big blinds in the pot? And I presume that our 9 big blinds are worth $9. Why is that? Because our starting stack is worth $10, right? That's just our supposition based on, based on that, right? I mean, we're $10 buy-in, and we have, that's what our stack is worth. So if we have 10 big blinds and our stack is worth $10, I'm just assuming at the beginning, assuming there's no ICM, that each big blind is worth $1, okay? I mean, I hope you can see why I'm doing that. So if the guy shoves on us and we decide to call, right, the final pot will be what? The final pot will be $20, right? There'll be 20 big blinds in the pot, right? $20. So we called 9 in a final pot of 20, right? Our contribution to that pot was 9 out of 20. So our showdown percentage needs to be 9 divided by 20, or 45%, to decide to get involved, right? So if we look at Poker Stove, and this is how I got those numbers, and I'm not going to go through it here, but the results of that were, just to show you the first example, I gave the first guy 15%. That's how it shook out. Apply, and it comes out to that. And then I gave the second guy, I I figured out what would the break even. Whoops. What calling range would give him 45% against that range, and I determined that it's basically the top 26%, and you run that, and it's basically just about 45%, right? So we can call, in that case, with a non-knockout tournament, given all the suppositions, we could call with the top 26% of hands, which is about 52 hands, and these are the hands, okay? So now let's look at the knockout tournament, right? First hand of a knockout tournament. Same thing, we're in the big blind, our stack is 10 blinds, 9 behind, 1 in the middle, the small blind shoves the top 15%, and we have to call our same 9 big blinds, or $9, right? The final pot, again, is going to be $20, but an additional reward of a $2 bounty. So we are calling $9, right, in a pot that is going to be $20 plus our $2 that we will also earn for the bounty. So in that case, we do the division, 9 divided by 22. We only need to be a 40.9% favorite. And when you do that out in Poker Stove, that ends up being about the top 42% of hands that we can call with. 42.1 or so. That ends up, if we run that, you can see we end up being just a shade under 40.9, close enough for our purposes. So we can call with the top 42% of hands, which is 80 hands, right? The 80, best hands, or 80, particular hands. Now, if we compare that to the, previous situation where it was not a knockout tournament, here we can only call with the top 26% of hands, and all of a sudden now we can call with the top 42% of hands, just because of the addition of the overlay that bounty provides. We can call, before we can now call with 80 hands instead of 52. So that's actually 28 more hands, or a 54% increase in the number of playable hands, right? So the conclusion is that, yeah, you probably should go, quote, out of your way to knock people out in the earlier rounds, as long as you know what you're doing. This is not indiscriminately calling people all in or whatever, but this is assuming you can, figure out your risk reward, their ranges, your equity against his range, and then how much of an overlay the bounty gives you and how that affects what you should call. So if you know what you're doing, yes, you should go out of your way in the earlier rounds, right? But that is the earlier rounds, when your stack is worth $10 and the bounty is $2, right? But what about later in the tournament? So let's look at the same tournament. Remember, this tournament was there. It had 403 players, right? But what happens to when it's now 100 players left, right? 303 players have been eliminated. And it's the same kind of situation. We'll just presume that the players have kept up with the blinds, and we have the average stack in the tournament. Say, we're not going to worry about ICM effects because it doesn't really affect it too much. There would be an ICM effect, but for the purposes of what I'm trying to illustrate, it doesn't matter. Our stack is the same 10 big blinds. We just have roughly the average stack. Folds around to the small blind, who shoves on us. And we say he's shoving again the top 15%. That's not necessarily realistic, but just as a supposition, right? So what's the situation? Well, we need to call 9 big blinds, or our 9 big blinds represents $30.80. Why is that? Where does that number come from? Well, that number comes from the fact that there's a certain amount of there's a prize pool, which is what, right? It's the amount of prize pool that has been set. Hold on. The amount of prize pool that's been set aside plus the remaining bounties, right? And since we're presumed to have a fair share of those remaining bounties, we can sort of include that in the prize pool in estimating what our stack is worth. All right. So if you do it out, oops, here we go. That's it. If you do it out, then it actually ends up that our stack, or at least each blind, is worth $3.42. $3.42.2, right? 3.422. All right. So if you just multiply that out by 9 big blinds, right, then that ends up being 3080 is what our stack is worth, all right? That's our fair share of the prize pool, forgetting the ICM effects. Now, in actual fact, we would probably be, our stack would be worth more than this, but that would only go to further illustrate the point I'm going to make. So let's say a guy shoves on you, right? It's going to be a 20 big blind pot, right? Because we're going to put in 9, and then there's 1.5 in the middle, and then, his 10. It's going to be a 20 big blind pot. And so if we do 20, big blinds times the value of each blind, you end up getting 68.44. So our needed showdown percentage is what? Well, it's exactly the same as it was in the first hand, right? There's no ICM effects, and we're still getting, the same ratio to 1, basically, the same pot odds, 9 to 20, basically. And so we need the same 45%, and that's the same top 26%. All right, so this is the non-knockout, and not assuming ICM effects. All right, so we can call with the same range. That shouldn't be very surprising. But now let's look at the knockout tournament. All right, 100 players left. The knockout tournament, same thing. We're in the blind, 10 big blinds. Guy shoves on us with the top 15%. The amount of our 9 big blinds that we have to call is 3080. And the final pot is still going to be 68.44, but there's a $2 additional reward, right? So our needed showdown percentage is 3080 divided by these two things added together, 70.84, and so we need to win 43.7% of the time, right? That's just the risk, the risk divided by risk plus reward. It's that same formula that I always harped on in Flying Blinds. It's that same thing. Risk divided by risk plus reward. So we need to be a 43.7% favorite to call. Well, what was it before without the bounty? Well, it was 45%. And here we can call very slightly looser. Now in practice, what does that look like? Well, now we can call with only the top 29% of hands, whereas at the early stage of the tournament, when the bounty represented a larger amount relative to the value of the stacks, we were able to call what? We were able to call with 42% of hands, and now we can only call with 29% of hands. So, whoops. So we can now call with 57 hands, because these are the hands, instead of 52. That's only 5 more hands. Not even a 10% increase in the number of playable hands that we can have. So my conclusion is no, you probably shouldn't go, very out of your way to knock people out in the later rounds. Once the effective stack's value, read this very carefully, once the effective stack's value is about 25 times the knockout amount, the bounty should hardly matter at all, if at all, right? Think about that. If the effective stack's value, now if you are a big stack and there is a tiny stack who you have the chance to eliminate, then you're only risking the amount of that his stack is worth. So you have to make a decision if how much you think his stack is worth, and if you're not taking ICM into account and his stack is if his stack you determine is worth about $10, then you can treat that situation as if it's the first hand, right? But if he has a very large stack and you have a very large stack, or not a very large stack, but I mean, if your stack has a value that has risen because of all the players that have been eliminated and your share of the prize pool is now bigger, once the effective stack's value is about 25 times the knockout amount, the bounty is almost completely irrelevant, right? So the bounty in this case is $2. Once your stack gets to be, in the $40 to $50 range, it shouldn't matter at all. Don't go out of your way to eliminate people. There's almost no added incentive. And then the question the guy asks was, last question was, should you try to take risks early to build a big stack so that you can knock more people out? No, you should take risks early to knock people, or you should take slightly wider risks early to knock people out for the immediate profit of doing so. You should take risks early in a large MTT to build a stack so that you can go on and pressure people with your big stack and continue to win, chips upon chips upon chips. But in terms of taking risks early to build a stack so that you can knock more people out later, almost completely irrelevant. So I hope that answers your question in that regard. And well, we're coming up on about, what, 55 minutes or so, and I think that's probably enough. So I hope that was interesting or useful to some of you. And again, if you have a sit and go question or a tournament question that you want answered in a future episode of Hey Van, send me an email at vandweller@deucescracked.com. Send me a PM on Deuces Cracked, or my username is vandweller, and be sure to include the phrase Hey Van in the subject line so I can make sure to see it. So anyway, look at that. Click to exit presentation. I'm going to click it. So anyway, I appreciate everybody watching the video, and I will see you next time.